The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a machine born of pure, uncompromising aggression and technological foresight that profoundly reshaped aerial warfare forever. It emerged from the secretive rearmament of the 1930s as a sleek, low-wing monoplane, a terrifying vision of the future when its rivals were still lumbering biplanes of a bygone era. Its early deployment in the Spanish Civil War provided a brutal proving ground, allowing the German Luftwaffe to not only test the airframe but to perfect the devastating finger-foot formation tactics. This single-minded focus on speed, climb rate, and powerful centerline armament made the Bf 109 the undisputed alpha predator of the skies during the initial campaigns of the Second World War. From the skies over Poland to the rapid fall of France, the aircraft's angular, deadly silhouette became synonymous with the swift, terrifying success of the Blitzkrieg. Allied pilots, flying older or less technologically sophisticated aircraft, quickly learned to dread the flash of a diving Bf 109, knowing its speed often allowed it to choose the engagement and disengage at will. The early UML variants, equipped with the fuel-injected Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, held a critical performance edge, particularly in diving maneuvers where the carburetor-equipped Allied engines would often cut out under negative G-forces. The Bf 109 was more than just a piece of technology, it was a psychological weapon, creating a narrative of German invincibility that was broadcast and amplified by the Axis propaganda machine. Its presence fundamentally altered the terms of engagement, forcing Allied designers and strategists into a desperate, reactive scramble to develop a credible, enduring countermeasure. For nearly 4 years, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the benchmark for all Axis and Allied fighters, a symbol of terrifying, cutting-edge aerial power that seemed utterly unchallengeable. Its revolutionary construction, including an all-metal stressed skin fuselage, allowed for a lightness and strength that contributed directly to its fantastic acceleration and high operational ceiling. The reputation of its high-scoring aces, like Adolf Galland and Werner Moldus, further cemented the 109 status as a near-mythical, invincible force in the eyes of the world. The deep-seated fear it instilled was a powerful strategic asset, creating hesitation and defensive posturing among the Allied pilots before a shot was even fired. The early models, while having a narrow cockpit and challenging landing gear, were perfectly optimized for the initial, brief, and decisive high-speed engagements dictated by German doctrine. The early reign of the Bf 109 was a harsh lesson in the vital importance of prioritizing aerodynamic science and engine technology in modern military aviation design. Its speed and power dictated that Allied forces had to respond not just with more aircraft, but with a fundamentally superior design to break the psychological and physical grip of the German fighter. The story of the Bf 109 began in 1934, when the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, issued a tender for a new single-seat fighter to replace the outdated biplanes then in service. Willy Messerschmitt's design, designated the Bf 109, was met with considerable skepticism from traditionalists who favored the high maneuverability of biplanes. Messerschmitt controversially opted for a high wing loading, monoplane configuration, a design choice that sacrificed slow speed handling for blistering velocity and a superior rate of climb. He correctly gambled that future aerial combat would be decided by boom and zoom tactics, where speed would be paramount and turning fights obsolete. The initial prototype, the Bf 109 V1, was actually powered by a British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, as the intended German power plant was not yet ready, a peculiar irony in the history of the rivals. The true breakthrough came with the integration of the German Daimler-Benz DB601 inverted VR12 engine, a masterpiece of engineering that provided the 109 its signature performance. The DB601 featured direct fuel injection, a key technical advantage that prevented the engine from cutting out during sudden negative G maneuvers, a critical weakness that afflicted the carbureted engines of the Spitfire and Hurricane. This fuel injection system allowed the Messerschmitt pilot to perform aggressive diving and pushover maneuvers without engine interruption, a tactical edge that terrorized Allied pilots for years. Other innovative features included an enclosed canopy, all-metal stressed skin construction, and a retractable landing gear, which were cutting-edge for the mid-1930s. However, the design's rigidity also led to its critical flaw, the inward retracting, narrow-track landing gear, which made ground handling notoriously difficult and caused a high number of training accidents. The fuselage was built to be exceptionally compact, prioritizing aerodynamics and structural simplicity for mass production, but this left virtually no room for future expansion of fuel tanks or heavier armament. Messerschmitt's vision created a lightweight, deadly, single-purpose fighter, perfectly suited for the initial aggressive campaigns, but its lack of stretched potential would prove to be its Achilles heel in the long run. The single central radiator was initially used, but later versions adopted twin radiators under the wings, further cleaning up the aircraft's profile for greater speed. The early adoption of machine guns and cannon firing through the propeller spinner or hub was an attempt to concentrate firepower, though it complicated maintenance. The philosophy behind the 109 was not one of elegant balance, but of an aerodynamic weapon system designed to destroy quickly and escape even faster. The Messerschmitt Bf109E, or Bemils as it was known, was the variant that truly entered the collective nightmare of the Allies during the tumultuous summer of 1940. It was the first mass-produced model to be powered by the superb DB601A engine, which provided over 1,000 horsepower and a marked superiority in both climb and high-altitude speed. This machine arrived over the English Channel in force, primarily tasked with escorting German bomber formations, determined to break the back of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command. The Emil was typically armed with two heavy 20mm FF cannon in the wings and two synchronized machine guns above the engine, a punch that often proved instantly fatal to its targets. In the early phases of the Battle of Britain, the speed and ceiling of the Bf109E often allowed it to operate almost as a true interceptor, engaging the defending fighters on its own terms. RAF pilots in the rugged, but slower, Hurricanes were particularly vulnerable to the Emil's high-speed dive and climb tactics, which they could not effectively counter without losing altitude. Even the legendary Spitfire Mk, while possessing superior horizontal turning capability, was often outclassed in climb and acceleration by the relentless, diving attacks of the German fighter. The Emil's most crippling limitation, however, was not one of design but of geography, as its short internal fuel capacity allowed for only a brief combat time over southern England before forcing a return home. This critical range issue, which was not solved by the external drop tanks until later in the war, was one of the few advantages the beleaguered RAF could consistently exploit during the protracted air battle. Despite this tactical constraint, the Bf109E was an undeniably formidable opponent, flown by highly experienced and aggressive pilots who had honed their skills over the battlefields of Europe. The roar of its powerful, liquid-cooled engine and the sight of its pointed nose emerging from a cloud bank was enough to trigger immediate defensive maneuvers in any Allied formation. The Battle of Britain served as the ultimate proving ground, where the Emil's structural and performance characteristics were tested to their absolute limit against a determined home defense. Its operational effectiveness ensured that German air supremacy was a terrifying reality across the continent, prompting a massive and urgent call for improved Allied fighter technology. The initial success rate of the Bf 109E provided a false sense of security to the Luftwaffe High Command, suggesting that the existing design was adequate for the entire war. This overconfidence prevented an earlier, more radical redesign, a strategic oversight that the British would capitalize on with their continuously evolving Spitfire. The core design of the Bf 109, while revolutionary in 1935, carried fundamental limitations that began to surface and magnify as the demands of total war increased. The primary design constraint was the inherent lack of volume within its tightly packed fuselage and thin wing, making internal upgrades exceedingly difficult without performance degradation. Every attempt to enhance the aircraft with more powerful engines, heavier cannons, or increased armor required external bulges and modifications that added parasitic drag. The narrow-track landing gear, retracted inwards to allow for the small, efficient wing, remained a persistent and deadly operational hazard, contributing to an unforgivable number of avoidable pilot and aircraft losses. This poor ground handling meant that takeoffs and landings were treacherous, demanding intense focus even from the most seasoned pilots, a problem the Allies did not face with their wider-track designs. Furthermore, the design's emphasis on speed meant sacrificing a degree of horizontal maneuverability, leaving the 109 vulnerable to classic turning fights against more agile aircraft like the Spitfire. The initial armament was fearsome, but the later demand for even heavier cannons, necessitating underwing gun pods, severely penalized the Bf 109's once pristine aerodynamics and overall flight characteristics. The cockpit canopy on early models was heavily framed, which significantly restricted the pilot's view to the rear and sides, a dangerous disadvantage in the chaos of a close-quarters dogfight. As the war progressed and engine technology improved, the 109 airframe simply did not have the internal capacity to accommodate the necessary fuel for extended, deep penetration escort missions over Russia or deep into Allied territory. By the time the Allies began fielding fighters with two-stage supercharged engines, the Bf 109's aging design was unable to house a comparable high-altitude power plant without becoming severely overstressed and difficult to fly. The lack of structural reserve meant that every increase in engine power pushed the airframe closer to its breaking point, severely limiting its ultimate growth potential. This rigidity in design would become a profound weakness, standing in stark contrast to the Spitfire's inherent adaptability and its willingness to be transformed through radical redesign. The constant need to retrofit the old airframe with modern equipment resulted in numerous, often confusing, variants, complicating maintenance and logistical support for ground crews. The later Messerschmitt models became heavier and slower than their predecessors, with their handling becoming increasingly sluggish and demanding for the younger pilots. The core vulnerability was that the 109 was a brilliant snapshot of 1930s fighter design, but it could not gracefully transition into the brutal, high-performance world of the mid-1940s. The Supermarine Spitfire was the brilliant, if somewhat delayed, counterpoint to the Messerschmitt's early reign, and its design was based on an entirely different philosophy. R.J. Mitchell's iconic elliptical wing was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency, providing a perfect blend of high speed and superb maneuverability that the Bf 109 lacked. The Spitfire Mk I and Mk II met the Emil head-on during the Battle of Britain, proving that a fighter could be fast, heavily armed, and still possess the agility to dominate a turning fight. While the Spitfire initially lacked the fuel injection advantage and high-altitude superiority of the early 109, its inherent handling characteristics and robust landing gear gave its pilots a psychological edge. The British machine was immediately beloved by its pilots for its responsive controls and exceptional visibility, allowing for confident, aggressive maneuvering in the heart of combat. The initial armament of 8.303 caliber machine guns was quickly deemed inadequate, but the Spitfire airframe effortlessly accommodated the change to the devastating 20 mm Hispano cannon in later models. Crucially, the Spitfire's entire design possessed a latent, yet profound, capacity for growth, a feature that would ensure its longevity and eventual dominance in the latter half of the war. The structural integrity and generous internal volume of the wing and fuselage meant that the Supermarine team could integrate heavier equipment, larger fuel tanks, and dramatically more powerful engines without fundamentally compromising the aircraft's performance. This adaptability meant that the Spitfire could evolve in lockstep with the enemy threat, always retaining a path for a performance upgrade to counter the next German innovation. Its wide-track landing gear ensured safe and easy operation from the often crude grass airfields of fighter command, contributing to higher operational readiness and fewer training losses. The Spitfire's resilience and ease of field repair, combined with the continuous upgrade path, meant that it never truly suffered the systemic obsolescence that began to plague the Bf 109. It became a national symbol of resistance and grace under pressure, a beautiful design that was also an incredibly potent and adaptable war machine. The early duels established that while the Bf 109 was master of the vertical dive, the Spitfire was the queen of the horizontal turn, forcing a tactical stalemate that necessitated the next major technological leap. The ultimate victory of the Spitfire platform lay not just in a single design, but in the vision to create a flexible, future-proof airframe capable of utilizing decades of engine development. The middle phase of the war saw the introduction of the Focke-Wulf FW-190, a new German fighter that profoundly complicated the ongoing air battle and temporarily rescued the Bf 109 from immediate obsolescence. The radial-engined FW-190, a robust and heavily armed machine, proved superior to the current Spitfire marks in almost every way at low to medium altitudes upon its debut. Its sudden arrival sent the RAF reeling and forced the British to rapidly develop the interim Spitfire Mk9, powered by the new two-stage supercharged Merlin engine, simply to stay in the fight. For the Luftwaffe, the FW-190 allowed them to implement a highly effective two-fighter strategy, pairing the new Butcher bird for low-level engagements with the Messerschmitt Bf 109G for high-altitude duties. The Bf 109G, or Gustav, was the Luftwaffe's answer to the need for greater power, incorporating the heavier Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, which boosted the horsepower to nearly 1,500. However, the Gustav's improvements were achieved only at the cost of its graceful flight characteristics, as the airframe was now severely burdened by the larger engine and heavier armament. The requirement to fit the larger engine and its associated cooling systems, along with heavier machine guns, led to the development of the distinctive, aerodynamically disruptive bulges on the nose. These additions earned the Bf 109G the unflattering nickname the Bulge among pilots, a visual testament to the difficulty of forcing a 1930s airframe into the role of a 1940s interceptor. The Gustav was faster than its predecessors but was also significantly heavier, less maneuverable at lower altitudes, and more demanding to fly, especially for the rapidly diminishing pool of experienced German pilots. The Messerschmitt was increasingly relegated to its core strength, high-altitude combat, where its lighter airframe still provided an advantage over the FW-190. The FW-190's existence ironically masked the 109's deepening weaknesses for a time, but the underlying issue of the design's lack of internal growth potential remained fundamentally unsolved. The pressure to continually upgrade the old platform through clumsy field modifications was a sign of the terminal limitations of the original Messerschmitt concept. This split development path ultimately benefited the Allies by presenting them with a clear qualitative advantage to overcome with a single, dedicated, high-performance design like the later Spitfire. The definitive turning point in the aerial arms race was not an airframe but an engine, the two-stage, two-speed supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This technological marvel was a direct, successful response to the altitude and power advantage the Axis once held with their supercharged engines. A supercharger is essentially a compressor that forces more air into the engine cylinders, dramatically boosting power, especially at the high altitudes where air is thin. The two-stage system incorporated a second, larger impeller that took the already compressed air from the first stage and compressed it again, providing an unprecedented boost. This system effectively doubled the engine's operational ceiling and pushed its horsepower output past the 1,700 mark, a monumental leap that had been unthinkable just a few years prior. The integration of this engine into the Spitfire airframe created the Mk9, a stopgap fighter that immediately regained air superiority from both the FW-190 and the Bf-109G. The power increase was so radical that it necessitated a change from the Spitfire's traditional three-bladed propeller to a four-bladed unit to effectively convert the immense power into thrust. The high-altitude performance of the two-stage Merlin meant that the Bf-109, which had been the master of the upper atmosphere, was now constantly looking up at a more powerful and faster Spitfire. The Allied engineering triumph not only closed the gap but definitively leapfrogged the best that the Daimler-Benz engines could offer within the constraints of the Messerschmitt airframe. This engine became the great equalizer, demonstrating that engine technology was the true bottleneck in fighter performance, not just the shape of the wing or the size of the armament. The Merlin's robust and adaptable design meant that it could continuously be refined and mass-produced, ensuring that every frontline British fighter was powered by a cutting-edge unit. The development of the two-stage supercharger was a triumph of wartime industrial collaboration and ingenious problem-solving under the intense pressure of continuous aerial conflict. This powerful new generation of engines laid the essential foundation for the truly final, ultimate evolution of the Spitfire platform, the radical Griffon-powered Mk14. Without the lessons and the engineering breakthroughs achieved in perfecting the two-stage Merlin, the later development would have been fundamentally impossible to achieve. The Spitfire Mk14 was not an evolution but a complete transformation, a deliberate decision to take the Spitfire beyond the limits of its own legendary engine, the Merlin. To decisively end the debate over air superiority, the decision was made to install the massive, two-stage supercharged Rolls-Royce Griffon engine into the Spitfire airframe. The Griffon was a beast of an engine, considerably larger and heavier than the Merlin, but it promised well over 2,000 horsepower, a crushing power advantage over any Axis fighter. This immense engine required a significant lengthening of the Spitfire's nose, giving the Mk14 a powerful, elongated profile that visually distinguished it from every earlier mark. The enormous torque generated by the Griffon necessitated the move to a massive five-bladed propeller, which efficiently transferred the brute force into phenomenal forward thrust. The Mk14, therefore, combined the proven, highly refined aerodynamics and handling of the Spitfire airframe with the raw, uncompromising power of a heavy-duty naval engine. The resulting aircraft possessed a startling rate of climb and a top speed that comfortably exceeded 450 miles per hour, placing it firmly in a new class of high-performance fighter. This was the first time that a single Allied fighter could confidently outperform the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in every single category of high-altitude flight, speed, climb, and ceiling. The Griffon Spitfire was designed to dominate and dictated the terms of every engagement, transforming the Allied pilot from a defender into a relentless, high-altitude hunter. Its arrival over the Western Front coincided with the final, desperate phases of the German war effort, acting as a final, decisive hammer blow to the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter strength. The radical redesign of the nose and the adoption of the massive propeller turned the Spitfire into a highly specialized interceptor, perfectly suited for the demands of the final air battles. The longer nose required a larger rudder to counteract the powerful engine's torque, further contributing to the Mk XIV's unique and powerful silhouette. The Mk XIV represented the final, successful realization of the Spitfire's full potential, a masterpiece of wartime engineering that married elegance with overwhelming force. Its ability to reach and sustain extreme altitudes with ease made it the perfect weapon for the challenges of intercepting high-flying enemy reconnaissance aircraft. The Spitfire Mk XIV's true performance triumph was its overwhelming and sustained superiority at the highest and most critical altitudes of combat. Where the Bf 109 had once been the king, effortlessly diving out of the sun, the Mk XIV now reigned supreme, capable of maintaining peak efficiency above 25,000 feet. The raw power of the two-stage Griffon engine meant that its rate of climb was utterly phenomenal, allowing the Spitfire to rapidly gain the tactical advantage of height over any Messerschmitt. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves in a terrifying reversal of roles, often struggling to outclimb or even hold pace with the new, powerful British fighter. The Bf 109's traditional boom and zoom tactics were now entirely neutralized, as the Mk XIV could easily match the German fighter's dive and then recover to pursue the retreating aircraft. The speed advantage was so stark that engaging a Mk XIV on anything but perfect, surprise terms became an almost suicidal proposition for the German pilots. The Mk XIV was a heavy hitter, typically carrying an armament of two 20mm Hispano cannons and 2.50 caliber machine guns, providing a superior destructive punch to even the final Bf 109 variants. Its ability to deliver this concentrated firepower at extreme velocities and altitudes made it a terrifyingly efficient aerial weapon system. The Spitfire Mk XIV was effectively the first truly modern air superiority fighter of the war, a machine whose performance completely broke the technological stalemate of the mid-war period. This dominance in the air was essential for protecting the Allied bomber streams and ensuring the success of the ground invasion in Normandy and beyond. The sheer feeling of flying a machine with such overwhelming power gave the Allied pilots an immense psychological advantage, a feeling that had long belonged to their German counterparts. The Mk XIV's introduction was not merely a performance gain, it was a statement that the initiative in the air war had permanently and decisively shifted to the Allied side. The final Bf 109 models, burdened with extra weight and constrained by the limits of their airframe, simply could not compete with the pure, unadulterated power of the Griffon engine. The relentless pressure applied by the Mk XIV forced the Luftwaffe to commit its dwindling resources to a lost cause, defending against an aerial weapon they could not match. The Messerschmitt Bf 109K, or Kurfürst, represented the final, most desperate attempt by the German design bureaus to maintain the fighter's combat relevance against the overwhelming Allied onslaught. The KF was equipped with the most powerful version of the Daimler-Benz engine, the DB605D, often boosted by complex injection systems like MW50 methanol water mixture to achieve fleeting bursts of power. These radical, complex performance boosters were a clear admission that the airframe itself was fundamentally maxed out and required artificial assistance to even approach modern standards. The KF was certainly the fastest BF-109 ever produced, but this performance came at the expense of every other flight characteristic, making it a tricky and unforgiving aircraft to handle. Its increased weight and high wing loading made it exceptionally difficult for inexperienced pilots to manage, particularly during the critical and dangerous moments of takeoff and landing. The design was stripped down in places to save weight, ironically making the aircraft less survivable than earlier versions when hit by the increasing firepower of Allied fighters. The entire production process was hampered by severe material shortages, lack of skilled labor, and constant Allied bombing, resulting in inconsistent quality control for the final machines. Many of the younger, often poorly trained pilots, rushed into the cockpit of the demanding Kurfürst, were simply not ready to face the seasoned veterans flying the vastly superior Spitfire Mk XIV. The Bf-109K was no longer a symbol of aerial dominance but a tragic final stand, a desperate attempt to defend a collapsing nation with an aircraft pushed far beyond its designed limits. Its deployment was a necessary but ultimately futile effort to hold the line against the total air superiority that the Allies, spearheaded by the Mk XIV, had firmly established. The once feared Messerschmitt had become a reactive, defensive machine, desperately trying to survive against an enemy that could simply choose not to engage until it possessed the overwhelming tactical advantage. The complexity of the final injection systems and the overstressed engine contributed to a poor serviceability rate, further diminishing the Luftwaffe's already depleted operational capacity. The Kurfürst was a powerful, but ultimately flawed and doomed, attempt to modernize a fighter that had simply run out of technological room to grow and evolve. The combat encounters between the Spitfire Mk XIV and the final Bf-109 variants were a decisive and conclusive demonstration of the shift in the balance of air power. The great advantage of the Mk XIV was that it completely negated the Messerschmitt's entire tactical doctrine of diving in from height and escaping on speed. The Spitfire could not only meet the 109 at its preferred altitude but could then engage it on equal terms in speed and completely dominate it in the rate of climb. The sheer acceleration of the Griffon-powered machine allowed the Spitfire pilot to rapidly close the distance, denying the Bf-109 the necessary time to build up an escape velocity. For the first time in the war, the Allied fighter pilot was in a position to confidently dictate the terms of the engagement, engaging when they chose and disengaging only when they desired. The Mk XIV's massive 5-bladed propeller provided an unparalleled bite, ensuring that the fighter maintained its high-speed performance even in tight turns and climbs. The final Bf-109K, burdened by its engine and heavy armament, was often sluggish and unresponsive at high speeds compared to the nimble and powerful Spitfire. The combat statistics from the final years of the war clearly reflected this qualitative mismatch, with Mk XIV squadrons achieving highly disproportionate kill ratios against the Messerschmitts. The terrifying reputation of the Bf-109, once a paralyzing fear for Allied pilots, was definitively broken by the arrival of the formidable and elegant British powerhouse. The air superiority established by the Spitfire Mk XIV was not merely tactical, it was strategic, ensuring the complete freedom of movement for Allied bombers and ground attack aircraft. Its high-speed capability made it the perfect counterweapon against the VE-1 flying bombs, successfully intercepting and destroying scores of the terror weapons before they could reach London. The Mk14 was the final, devastating answer in a long technological argument, proving that the adaptability of the Spitfire airframe was ultimately superior to the initial aggression of the Messerschmitt design. Its presence in the sky was a clear and unambiguous signal that the Luftwaffe's era of aerial dominance was definitively over, replaced by a new, more powerful, and faster Allied champion. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Supermarine Spitfire Mk14 stand today as twin pillars in the pantheon of military aviation history. The Bf 109's legacy is that of the revolutionary pioneer, a machine that defined the brutal speed and efficiency of the first generation of modern, single-wing fighters. Its incredible production run of nearly 34,000 aircraft is a testament to the fundamental brilliance of its core design concept and its operational utility throughout the entire conflict. It will always be remembered as the initial king of the air, the terrifying machine that forced the Allies to fight for their survival and to innovate at a desperate pace. The Spitfire Mk XIV's legacy, conversely, is one of relentless, successful evolution and engineering brilliance, a design that refused to become obsolete despite the rapid pace of technological change. It demonstrated that a solid initial concept, when combined with a flexible airframe and an adaptable engine program, could remain the master of the sky for nearly a decade. The Mk14, the ultimate expression of the Spitfire, was the decisive factor that finally neutralized and then surpassed the long-standing performance advantages of its German rival. Together, these two fighters represent the complete arc of the Second World War's aerial struggle, from the initial Axis dominance to the final, overwhelming Allied air superiority. They pushed the limits of piston engine technology, forcing unprecedented advances in aerodynamics, material science, and engine supercharging that paved the way for the jet age. The pilots who flew them, both German and Allied, speak of the aircraft with profound respect, recognizing the genius that went into creating such high-performance war machines. Their intense, years-long rivalry provides a perfect case study in technological competition, where adaptability and strategic vision ultimately triumphed over initial revolutionary design. The angular, almost brutal lines of the Messerschmitt and the smooth, elegant curves of the Spitfire Mk14 tell a visual story of two distinct and legendary engineering philosophies. They are the great adversaries, forever linked in history, each necessary to define the legendary status of the other as the true icons of World War II's air war.